Good day to one and all. Today we shall discuss the 4 yogas that are dealt with in the Bhagavad Gita. Now, this topic is a very important topic covered in the BA Philosophy program of the University of Kerala. So, let us start. What is basically the Bhagavad Gita? The Bhagavad Gita literally means the Lord's song. It is set in the battlefield of Kurukshetra, where the historical battle between the Pandavas, who represented the forces of righteousness, and Kauravas, who represented the forces of evil, was fought. The Bhagavad Gita is in the form of a dialogue between Sri Krishna, who donned the role of charioteer of the mighty Arjuna, and Arjuna himself. The immediate goal of the Bhagavad Gita was to persuade the reluctant Arjuna to fight. However, the Gita was in fact addressed to the whole human race, with Arjuna as the representative of the ordinary human being confronted with the problems and complexities of life. Hence, its enduring value and universal appeal. The Bhagavad Gita is essentially a manual of life that advocates human beings to face the challenges of life with wisdom and courage, and orient the whole life in thought, word, and deed to attain moksha, the highest end of human life. Its teaching is best represented by the phrase, the philosophy of enlightened action. The Bhagavad Gita forms a part of the great Indian epic Mahabharata, being situated in the Bhishma Parva of the epic. It runs to 700 verses in a framework of 18 chapters that presents in a nutshell the entire essence of the Upanishads. Gandhiji used to call the Bhagavad Gita his spiritual reference book. He has remarked, I quote, "When doubts haunt me, when disappointments stare me in the face, and I see not one ray of hope on the horizon, I turn to the Bhagavad Gita and find a verse to comfort me, and I begin to smile in the midst of overwhelming sorrow." Unquote. In the words of Aldous Huxley again, I quote, "The Gita is one of the clearest and the most comprehensive summaries of the perennial philosophy ever to have been made. Hence its enduring value not only for Indians but for all mankind." Unquote. Now, let us take a look at the basic teachings of the Bhagavad Gita. The central teaching of the Bhagavad Gita is the same as that of the Upanishads. In the colophon at the end of each chapter, the descriptive tags Brahma Vidya and Yoga Shastra are to be found, and each chapter is styled as an Upanishad. The Gita starts with the despondency of Arjuna upon seeing his kith and kin on the side of the Kauravas, ready to fight against him. He foresees no advantage in killing these relatives and decides that he will not kill them even if he is to be killed by them instead. Sri Krishna then proceeds to instruct him that it is his duty as a prince, as a warrior, and as a righteous man to fight against the enemies who represent evil and thereby restore peace. In the process of convincing Arjuna, Sri Krishna expounds the highest philosophy, which is in fact the condensed essence of the Upanishads. The Bhagavad Gita is a holistic philosophical treatise as it contains metaphysics, ethics, and religion. It builds up a philosophy of karma based on jnana and supported by bhakti in a beautiful manner. Some people have tried to read in the Gita a cult of murder, but this simply shows the extent to which a noble work can be misinterpreted. To fight against evil is the duty of every man. He has to uncompromisingly follow his swadharma, which in turn is based on his mental disposition and qualities. The Bhagavad Gita is also unique in upholding the importance of rational and critical analysis and the virtue of the freedom of choice and its resultant responsibility. After giving the entire discourse, Sri Krishna tells Arjuna that he is now free to rationally and critically analyze all that Sri Krishna taught and do that which Arjuna feels right. The verse is very, very famous. Vimarsha etat asheshena yathechasi tata kuru. Now let us take a look at the metaphysics of the Bhagavad Gita. The fundamental metaphysical teaching of the Bhagavad Gita is that of the unreal there is no being and of the real there is no non-being. Nasate vidyate bhavo na bhavo vidyate sataha. The soul is indestructible, that is avinashi, eternal nitya, unborn aja, undiminishing avyaya, unthinkable achintya, and immutable avikarya. The body alone undergoes destruction and not the soul. The soul is neither born nor does it die. It is immortal, not being subject to birth and death. It cannot perish along with the body. Just as a person casts off worn out garments and puts on new ones, so does the soul cast off worn out bodies and enters into new ones. The infinite underlies and animates all finite existences, and the soul, being essentially one with it, is not affected by birth, death, growth, and decay. He who sees the ultimate reality seated equally in all beings and unperishing within the perishing sees truly. Now let us move on to the notion of yoga in the Bhagavad Gita. The literal meaning of the word yoga is union. It has its origin in the Sanskrit root yuj, which stands for union. Yoga is the union of the individual soul and the absolute. It has many definitions and connotations. It means equanimity or balance of mind, which is called as samatva. It also means dexterity or proficiency in action, and basically refers to the higher form of action performed with a spirit of detachment. The yogi is the ideal ascetic who curbs his thoughts and passions and maintains calmness in all the opposites of life like heat and cold, joy and sorrow, honor and dishonor, etc. The yogi who completely curbs his passions and maintains calmness in heat and yields himself completely in the absorption of the divine is compared in the Bhagavad Gita to a lamp that does not flicker in a windless place. We also find the following beautiful description of yoga in the Bhagavad Gita. I quote, where seeing the self by the self, one is satisfied in oneself, where one experiences the absolute bliss known only to higher reason, but ever beyond the senses, and standing where one swerves not from the truth, where no other gain is considered greater, where one is not moved by the greatest pain, that state, free from misery, is yoga. Unquote. A yogi is a sthita prajna, one who is firmly rooted in higher reason and unmoved by the pair of opposites. He attains to the highest state of Brahman, which is called as the Brahmi sthiti, where he is not bewildered, nainam prapya vimuhyati, and from which he never falls down, yad gatvana nivartante tad dhama paramam mama. Now let us take a look at the synthesis of yogas in the Bhagavad Gita. The Bhagavad Gita represents a unique synthesis of action, devotion, and knowledge. The human being is a complex of intellect, will, and emotion. He is a being who thinks, wills, and feels. Intellect has given rise to the philosophy of knowledge, will to the philosophy of action, and emotion to the philosophy of devotion. Modern psychology teaches us that these three aspects of mind are distinguishable only in thought and not divisible in reality. There is no watertight division separating one from the other. The teaching of the Gita is in keeping with this view. Different people attain the same goal of salvation by these three different paths of knowledge, action, and devotion. All three ultimately stand synthesized in the Bhagavad Gita. Now let us take a look at the first of the four yogas, that is Nyana Yoga. Nyana Yoga is essentially and predominantly the path of knowledge. The yogi's ideal is self-realization, which cannot be attained without knowledge. Even the devotees are granted knowledge by God so that they may realize the goal. Yoga, bereft of knowledge, is an impossibility. The power of the senses may be weakened by fasting and abstaining from necessities, but unless we rise above the relish and desire, the psychological attachment to the sense objects, we are not true yogis. This can be accomplished only with the rise of true knowledge. The high place accorded to knowledge can be discerned from the following. I quote, "Even the most sinful man can cross over the ocean of samsara by means of the boat of knowledge alone. As a fire well kindled reduces fuel to ashes, so the fire of knowledge reduces all action to ashes. The culmination of action is knowledge. Having obtained knowledge, one soon embraces peace. There is nothing purer than knowledge. As the Bhagavad Gita says, Nahi jnanena sadrisham pavitram iha vidyate." Unquote. Now let us move on to Karma Yoga. Karma Yoga is not opposed to Jnana Yoga according to the Bhagavad Gita. In fact, the former is possible only when the latter is attained. No embodied being can completely renounce actions. The constituent gunas of Prakriti, that is Sattva, Rajas and Tamas, necessarily give rise to actions. The universe itself depends on actions. Inertia is not liberty but death. Work keeps up the cycle of the universe, and it is the duty of every individual to help it. He who does not do so and finds pleasure in the senses is sinful and lives in vain. The ideal of the Bhagavad Gita is not negativism, asceticism, or escapism. It is not the negation of actions, but performance of actions in a spirit of detachment, which is called as Nishkama Karma. The giving up is not action itself, but of interest, desire, fruit, and attachment to action. Desire binds human beings, therefore, he should act in such a way that action does not bind him. The Gita teaching stands not for renunciation of action, but renunciation in action. It is emphatically stated that sannyasa does not mean the renunciation of action, but of interest, desire, and attachment for the fruits of action. Kamyanam karmanam nyasam sannyasam kavayo viduhu. Actions are our sphere, fruits are not our concern. We should never be attached to the fruits of actions, and at the same time, we should never be inactive. Without knowledge, renunciation of desire and attachment is not possible. Therefore, only a true jnani can perform nishkama karma. Here arises an apparent contradiction in the Gita, where it is also remarked that for him who has realized the self, who enjoys the bliss of the self, and who remains ever satisfied in the supreme peace of the self, for him there remains nothing to be done. The perfect man has no axe of his own to grind. He simply acts for the good of the people. Sri Krishna can himself be taken as an ideal for the perfect man, as he never ceases to act, although he has nothing to accomplish for himself. The perfect man works for the benefit of humanity, and this is the celebrated concept of Loka Sangraha in the Bhagavad Gita. And he works in the spirit of perfect detachment, selflessness, and with no desire to reap the fruits of actions. He who performs actions in a detached manner, thinking himself to be a mere instrument of God, is not contaminated by sin like the lotus leaf that lives in water and yet is not wetted by it. But the Gita definitely recognizes a supra-social status for the liberated sage. He cannot be forced to work. He may also not live in society, but his very presence in the world is a blessing for all creation, like the presence of the sun. Now let us move on to Bhakti Yoga. Bhakti or devotion is defined as the selfless loving service to God. It is a form of karma, but again, selfless karma is not possible without knowledge. Hence, perfect bhakti, like nishkama karma, can be practiced only by a true jnani. Only a jnani can completely resign himself to God. The devotee is confident of the guarantee given by God. Never does my devotee perish. A very important statement in the Bhagavad Gita. Name bhakta pranashyati. And the doer of good never comes to grief. Nahi kalyanakrit kaschit durgadim tata gachati. Sri Krishna says, I quote, even if a very ill-conducted man worships me, not worshipping anyone else, he must certainly be deemed to be good. For he has well resolved. He soon becomes devout of heart and obtains lasting tranquility. O Arjuna, know firmly that my devotee is never ruined. He who does my work, who yields himself up to me, who is devoted to me, void of attachment, without hatred to anyone, O Arjuna, comes to me. Unquote. The object of devotion is the personal God, the Purushottama, on whose mercy the devotee has to throw himself utterly. Absolute dependence and utter faith are necessary. Sri Krishna says, I quote, merge thy mind in me, be my devotee, prostrate thyself before me, thou shalt come up to me. I pledge thee my word, thou art dear to me. Abandoning all dharmas, come unto me for shelter. Sorrow not, I will liberate thee from all sins. Unquote. God himself lifts up his devotees from the ocean of birth and death. Love of God is the supreme love, and every other form of it is an imperfect manifestation of this supreme love. Out of the four kinds of devotees, that is, the suffering called as the artha, the seeker for truth, jitnyasu, the seeker of material prosperity, artharthi, and the wise, that is the jnani, the last one is the highest. He alone knows that God pervades the entire universe, Vasudeva Sarvamiti. He sees God in everything and everything in God. He knows that all is strung on God like pearls on a string, that God is the immanent inner controller of all. When devotion is perfect, then the individual and his God become suffused into one spiritual ecstasy and reveal themselves as aspects of one reality. Absolute monism is therefore the completion of the dualism with which the devotional consciousness starts. Now let us move on to the last of the four yogas, which is Raja Yoga. The term Raja is derived from the Sanskrit royal union or king, referring to the principal concern of Raja Yoga with the cultivation of the mind, hence the king aspect of one's own being. Through meditation such as pranayama and dhyana, to reach a meditative state of samadhi, quiet state of blissful awareness. It is the most esoteric yoga, actively practiced by the fewest of Indians. It is referred to throughout the Bhagavad Gita and especially in chapter 6. As with the other forms of yoga, the ultimate goal of Raja Yoga is to seek to have one achieve a state of liberation and obtain moksha. But Raja Yoga encompasses and differentiates itself from other forms of yogas by using meditation to avoid mental obsessions and false mental states, to limit the oscillation of the mind. One's thoughts and feelings, one's perceptions and memories can just as easily distort and veil the true self, becoming obsessed with attachments and desires. As a meditative method, Raja Yoga seeks to dissolve these mental barriers in order to further one's acquaintance with reality and control the life forces of the universe to better realize the universal self. Thank you.